You're standing in line at a coffee shop on an ordinary afternoon, barely paying attention to the people around you. Your mind is somewhere else. Work, bills, unfinished messages, the usual noise of life. Then someone walks in, and for some reason, you notice them immediately. Not because they're the most attractive person in the room. Not even because they look like your type. Actually, if you're honest, there's something strangely different about them. The way they carry themselves feels calmer than you, more grounded, more mysterious. While everyone else seems eager to be noticed, they don't seem to be trying at all. You look away for a second, then catch yourself looking back again, and the strange part is, you can't fully explain why. Later that night, you think about them again for no logical reason. Not obsessively. Just enough to bother you a little. Enough to make you wonder why certain people affect you before they've even become important in your life. Most people assume attraction is simple. Shared interests, shared personalities, shared lifestyles. The world constantly tells you that compatibility is the foundation of connection. That the more similar two people are, the more naturally love should happen. But if that were completely true, then why do some of the most unforgettable people in your life feel nothing like you at all? Why does the quiet person affect the loud one so deeply? Why does emotional intensity often appear between opposites? Why do certain people feel magnetic even when they make no sense on paper? Because attraction is rarely just logical. Human beings are not only drawn toward familiarity, they are also drawn toward contrast, toward mystery, toward qualities they secretly lost, suppressed, or never fully developed within themselves. That's where polarity begins, not manipulation. Not toxic games, not pretending to be hard to get. Real polarity is the emotional tension created when two very different energies awaken something inside each other. You've probably experienced this without realizing it. Maybe you were the overthinker who became fascinated by someone calm enough to slow your mind down. Maybe you were emotionally guarded until one person somehow made you speak more honestly than usual. Or maybe you met someone whose confidence, softness, unpredictability, or emotional depth made you feel more alive simply by being around them. And that feeling stayed with you, not because they completed you, but because they activated parts of you that had been asleep for years. I remember a friend once telling me about a relationship she couldn't fully explain. For years she dated people who were almost identical to her. Same humor, same energy, same emotional patterns. Everything felt easy in the beginning, but eventually every relationship started feeling emotionally flat. Then she met someone completely different. She was expressive, impulsive, emotionally intense. He was calm, patient, difficult to read. At first, their differences frustrated her. Conversations felt unpredictable. The emotional tension between them was unfamiliar. But slowly, she realized something deeper was happening. For the first time in years, she felt emotionally awake. Not anxious, not addicted, not trapped. Alive. And maybe that's why some people become unforgettable. Not because they were perfect for you, but because they introduced you to a version of yourself you had never met before. In this audiobook, we're going to explore the hidden psychology behind polarity and attraction, why opposites create emotional intensity, why mystery affects desire, why modern relationships often lose chemistry over time, and why the people who affect you most deeply are often reflections of the parts of yourself you've been disconnected from the longest. Because sometimes attraction is not pulling you toward another person. Sometimes it's pulling you toward another version of yourself. Chapter 1. The people who feel most alive are rarely the most predictable. A strange thing starts happening after you meet them. Your days stay mostly the same. You still wake up tired some mornings. You still go through routines without thinking much about them. Coffee, work, traffic, random conversations you barely remember an hour later. But somewhere underneath all of it, there's movement now. You notice it in small moments. Like when your phone lights up and part of you hopes it's them before you even look. Or when something funny happens during the day and they become the first person you want to tell. Or when you catch yourself replaying one conversation while standing in the grocery store staring at shelves you're not actually paying attention to. Nothing dramatic has even happened yet. That's what makes it confusing. Because logically, this person shouldn't affect you this much. They aren't giving you constant reassurance. They aren't trying to impress you every second. Sometimes they seem emotionally close. Other times they disappear into their own world for a while. Conversations with them feel alive, but never fully predictable. And somehow, that unpredictability keeps pulling your attention back. Most people don't like admitting this. We prefer saying we want peace, stability, emotional certainty, and part of us genuinely does. Especially after painful experiences, especially after chaos. At some point, everyone becomes tired of emotional games. But there's another truth people avoid talking about. Human beings are deeply affected by emotional tension. Not toxicity, not confusion, not manipulation, tension. The feeling that something inside you becomes more awake around another person. You can see this everywhere once you notice it. Some relationships slowly become routines people perform instead of experiences people feel. Two people talk every day, but nothing surprises them anymore. Nothing challenges them emotionally. Every interaction becomes efficient, predictable, emotionally flat. And eventually, they stop seeing each other clearly. Not because love disappeared overnight. Because attention disappeared first. That's the part most people misunderstand about attraction. Attention is emotional energy, and the human brain naturally moves toward what feels emotionally stimulating. I remember overhearing a conversation between two co-workers a few years ago during lunch. One of them had been in a relationship for almost 7 years. From the outside, everything looked solid. No drama, no instability. Their lives fit together perfectly. But then he said something that stayed with me for a long time. It feels like we already know every version of each other. At first, it sounded romantic. Then he kept talking. We don't surprise each other anymore. We barely even look at each other when we talk. And suddenly, the sentence didn't sound romantic at all. It sounded lonely. That's the strange danger of predictability. It creates safety, but too much of it can slowly remove emotional presence. Because people don't obsess over what feels emotionally finished. They obsess over what still feels alive. That's why opposites can create such powerful attraction. The emotionally expressive person disrupts the emotionally guarded one. The calm person slows down the chaotic one. The spontaneous person pulls the overly controlled person back into emotional spontaneity. Not because opposite personalities magically solve each other, but because difference creates movement, and movement creates attention. You've probably experienced this yourself without realizing it. Maybe you once dated someone who checked every box on paper. They treated you well, communicated clearly, wanted the same future. There was nothing obviously wrong with them, but somewhere deep inside, you felt emotionally asleep. Then later, someone completely different entered your life. Someone harder to predict. Someone whose energy challenged your emotional rhythm instead of matching it perfectly. And suddenly you started feeling things again. You laughed harder, thought deeper, noticed yourself more. Even silence around them felt charged somehow. That feeling can be dangerous if it turns into instability. A lot of people mistake anxiety for chemistry because both create intensity in the body. We'll talk about that later. But healthy attraction still contains emotional contrast because contrast creates awareness. Think about how difficult it is to notice your own patterns when everything around you feels familiar. Most people move through life half asleep emotionally because nothing interrupts their internal routine anymore. Then someone different enters their world, and suddenly everything sharpens again. Conversations feel slower, eye contact feels heavier, silence feels meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, they stop operating on autopilot. That's why some people become unforgettable long before the relationship itself becomes serious. They interrupt your emotional pattern, not through perfection, through presence. A lot of people spend years searching for someone who makes them feel safe, while secretly grieving the feeling of emotional aliveness they once had with someone else. Not because the other person was healthier, not because the relationship would have worked, but because they felt awake around them. And maybe that's the real reason attraction feels so powerful sometimes. It's not always about wanting the other person. Sometimes it's about wanting the version of yourself that existed around them. The version of you that felt curious again, emotionally open again, present again. Because deep attraction doesn't just pull your attention toward another human being. It pulls you out of emotional numbness. And once someone makes you feel more alive than you've felt in years, your mind rarely forgets them completely. Chapter 2. Sometimes you're not attracted to them. You're attracted to who you become around them. A few months pass, and without realizing it, you start changing in small ways around this person. Not fake changes, not performative ones. Subtle ones. You stay out later than usual during conversations because talking to them doesn't drain you the way most interactions do. You say things more honestly. You laugh louder. You stop rehearsing every sentence in your head before speaking. And maybe the strangest part is this: you feel more like yourself around someone completely different from you. At first, that doesn't make sense. Most people assume attraction comes from similarity, shared personalities, shared habits, shared ways of thinking. But some of the strongest emotional connections happen when another person awakens qualities inside you that have been buried for years. Not because they are better than you, because they access parts of you that everyday life slowly forced into hiding. You see this happen all the time without noticing it. The emotionally serious person becomes fascinated by someone playful. The overthinker becomes drawn towards someone emotionally calm. The highly disciplined person suddenly feels alive around someone's spontaneous and unpredictable, and the attraction feels deeper than physical appearance alone. Because it's psychological. A friend of mine once told me about a relationship that completely changed the way he saw himself. Before meeting her, his entire life revolved around control. Every day was structured, every decision calculated. Even emotionally, he stayed measured all the time. Calm voice, calm reactions, calm image. Everyone described him as stable, but privately he admitted something different. He felt emotionally numb most of the time. Then he met someone who completely disrupted that rhythm. She was expressive, impulsive, emotionally open in ways that made him uncomfortable at first. She would stop in the middle of walks to point out random details he never noticed. She talked to strangers, changed plans suddenly, played music too loudly in the car. At first, part of him judged her for it. Then slowly, something unexpected happened. He started feeling alive again, not because she fixed his life, because she reintroduced him to parts of himself he abandoned years earlier. That's the hidden psychology behind polarity most people never realize. Sometimes attraction is not about wanting another person. Sometimes it's grief for the version of yourself you lost while trying to survive adulthood. The version of you that used to feel spontaneous, emotionally expressive, curious, present. Life slowly trains people into emotional predictability. Responsibilities grow, stress accumulates. Routines repeat, and without noticing it, many people become smaller versions of themselves over time. More controlled, more guarded, more emotionally efficient. Then one day, someone completely different enters your life, and suddenly parts of you wake back up. That feeling can be overwhelming, Because it doesn't feel like ordinary attraction. It feels like expansion. You notice it in strange moments. You start listening to music differently. You become more emotionally aware during conversations. Colors feel sharper somehow. Ordinary days stop feeling completely mechanical. Not because the other person is magical, because they interrupted emotional autopilot. Carl Jung once believed that people are often drawn toward qualities in others that they unconsciously rejected inside themselves. The confident person secretly longs for softness. The emotionally guarded person longs for vulnerability. The hyper-independent person secretly longs to feel emotionally held by someone else. And when another person embodies those missing qualities naturally, attraction becomes powerful. Not always healthy, not always permanent, but powerful, because deep attraction often begins where emotional imbalance exists. You can even see this in the people you admire most. Usually, admiration is not random. The traits that fascinate you in others often reveal something missing or underdeveloped inside yourself. The quiet person admires emotional confidence. The emotionally chaotic person admires stability. The rigid person admires freedom. And sometimes attraction is simply admiration mixed with emotional longing. That realization changes the way you see relationships completely, because suddenly, attraction stops being only about chemistry. It becomes information, a mirror, a clue about the parts of yourself asking to grow. That's why some relationships affect you deeply even when they don't last long. The relationship itself may end, but the self-awareness it awakened stays with you for years. You don't just remember the person, you remember who you became around them. That's the part people struggle to move on from. Not always the relationship itself, the emotional expansion. You see this clearly after certain breakups. Sometimes people say, "I miss how they made me feel." But often what they really mean is, "I miss who I was when I was with them." More open, more alive, more emotionally connected to life. That's why some people spend years chasing the same emotional type over and over again. They aren't only chasing a person. They're chasing access to a forgotten part of themselves. And this is where attraction becomes dangerous if you don't understand it. Because sometimes people become addicted to another person when what they actually crave is emotional aliveness. They think, "I need them." But deeper down, the truth is often, "I miss the version of myself that existed around them." That realization changes everything. Because now attraction stops feeling random. You start seeing that every powerful connection reveals something about your inner world, your emotional hunger, your suppressed identity, your unfinished growth. The people who affect you most deeply are usually not mirrors of who you already are. They are mirrors of who you are becoming. And maybe that's why opposites create such powerful attraction sometimes. Not because opposite people complete each other perfectly, but because they wake each other up. Because every once in a while, another human being walks into your life and reminds you there are still parts of yourself waiting to exist. Chapter 3. The more people try to look unbothered, the less they feel. You notice it one night while sitting across from someone you supposedly care about. The conversation is smooth, easy, polite. Too polite. Both of you are talking, but neither of you is really saying anything real anymore. Every answer sounds emotionally filtered, safe, measured, like two people trying not to disturb the surface of the water too much. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation, you suddenly realize something uncomfortable. Neither of you wants to look vulnerable first. So instead, both of you pretend to be emotionally unaffected. That's the strange thing about modern relationships. A lot of people are starving for emotional connection while doing everything possible to avoid emotional exposure. Everyone wants intimacy. Nobody wants risk. People want to be understood deeply, but they also want complete emotional control at all times. They want closeness without uncertainty, desire without vulnerability, love without the possibility of rejection. And slowly, this creates emotionally flat relationships where nobody fully reveals themselves anymore. You can feel it everywhere now. People type messages, delete them, rewrite them to sound less emotional. They wait hours before replying so they don't appear too interested. They pretend not to care because caring feels dangerous. And the more emotionally self-protective people become, the weaker polarity becomes too. Because attraction needs emotional movement, not emotional chaos. Movement. Someone has to be willing to reveal something real first. I remember being at dinner once with a couple who had been together for years. On the surface, they looked completely stable. No fighting, no tension, no visible problems. But the entire dinner felt emotionally cold somehow. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. At one point, the woman started talking about a stressful situation happening at work. Nothing dramatic, just normal life frustration. But halfway through explaining it, she stopped herself and laughed awkwardly. "It's not a big deal," she said quickly, and her partner immediately nodded. "Yeah, you're overthinking it." The conversation moved on. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not because of what was said, because of what disappeared. You could actually watch vulnerability close in real time. One person almost opened emotionally. The other person unintentionally shut the moment down. And both people returned to emotional safety as fast as possible. That's how emotional distance quietly grows in relationships. Not through giant betrayals, through tiny moments where people stop feeling emotionally seen. The problem is that many people today mistake emotional detachment for strength. They think being emotionally unaffected makes them attractive, so they train themselves to stay composed all the time. Calm voice, controlled reactions, no emotional transparency. But after a while, nobody can feel them anymore. And attraction slowly dies in emotional neutrality because polarity depends on contrast. One person softens, the other person grounds. One person expresses emotion, the other creates emotional safety for it. That dynamic creates movement, energy, tension. But when both people are performing emotional control constantly, the relationship becomes emotionally static. It starts feeling like two highly self-aware strangers managing an interaction instead of two human beings experiencing each other honestly. You've probably felt this yourself. Maybe you once cared deeply about someone, but spent most of the relationship pretending not to. Maybe you wanted to text them first, but stopped yourself. Maybe you wanted to admit you missed them, but your pride interrupted the moment. And the strange part is, they were probably doing the exact same thing. Two people wanting connection, both waiting for the other person to risk vulnerability first. That's one of the hidden tragedies of modern attraction. People are becoming emotionally intelligent enough to analyze connection, but emotionally guarded enough to stop fully experiencing it. And eventually, relationships begin feeling emotionally managed instead of emotionally alive. You can especially see this in people who have been hurt before. After enough disappointment, many people unconsciously build personalities around emotional self-protection. They become hyper-independent, hard to read, emotionally restrained, not because they stopped feeling deeply, because feeling deeply became associated with pain. So now, instead of expressing interest naturally, they monitor themselves constantly. Don't text too fast, don't seem too available. Don't look too emotional, don't lose control. But attraction rarely survives inside constant self-monitoring. Real chemistry needs emotional spontaneity sometimes. That's why opposites often create tension in powerful ways. The emotionally expressive person forces the emotionally guarded person to confront feelings they usually hide. The emotionally calm person makes the anxious person feel safe enough to soften. And sometimes that difference becomes magnetic because both people are experiencing the emotional territory they normally avoid. That's what polarity often is at its core. Not dominance, not games. Emotional contrast creating emotional movement. But movement only exists when people stop trying to appear emotionally invincible all the time. A friend once told me something after the end of a relationship that lasted almost 4 years. "We spent so much time trying to look unaffected," he said, "that eventually we actually became disconnected." That sentence hit harder than he realized, because that's exactly what happens to many people. They suppress emotional honesty so consistently that eventually the relationship loses emotional oxygen completely. No emotional risk, no emotional exposure, no emotional tension, and eventually no emotional aliveness either. The strange irony is that people often become most attractive when they stop trying so hard to protect their image, when they laugh too hard unexpectedly, when they admit something honest, when they reveal uncertainty instead of performing perfection. Because perfection creates distance, humanity creates connection. And maybe that's why the people who affect us most deeply are rarely the people who look the most emotionally controlled. They are usually the people who made us feel safe enough to stop performing too. The people who made conversations feel real again. The people who reminded us that attraction is not built through emotional perfection. It's built through emotional presence. Chapter 4. The most intense attraction is not always love at first. It feels exciting. Your phone lights up unexpectedly and your entire mood changes. One message from them can make a stressful day suddenly feel lighter. One cold reply can ruin your concentration for hours. You tell yourself it's chemistry, strong chemistry, because no one has affected you this intensely in years. But slowly, something strange begins happening. You stop feeling calm around them. You start analyzing everything, the delay between replies, their tone, their energy, the way they act affectionate one day and distant the next. And without realizing it, your nervous system becomes attached to unpredictability itself. That's the dangerous side of attraction nobody talks about enough. Sometimes what feels intense is not emotional compatibility. It's emotional survival mode. A lot of people confuse anxiety with chemistry because both create emotional intensity in the body. Your heart races, your thoughts become obsessive, your emotions feel heightened, the connection feels impossible to ignore. But intensity alone is not proof of love. Sometimes it's proof that your nervous system no longer feels emotionally safe. You can usually recognize the difference by noticing what happens when you're alone. Healthy attraction may excite you, but it still leaves room for peace. You can focus on your life, you can breathe, you still feel connected to yourself. Unhealthy attraction slowly disconnects you from yourself completely. You become hyper-aware of another person's moods while losing awareness of your own. And the terrifying part is that many people mistake this emotional instability for passion, because stable love often feels quieter than emotional chaos. I remember a friend once describing a relationship that consumed almost 2 years of her life. In the beginning, she believed she had finally met someone who understood her deeply. Their conversations lasted for hours. The emotional intensity between them felt overwhelming. Every interaction felt charged with tension. But over time, she started noticing something darker underneath the attraction. She never felt emotionally secure. Some days he made her feel deeply wanted. Other days he disappeared emotionally without explanation. When she pulled away, he came closer. When she relaxed, he became distant again. And because the emotional highs felt so powerful, she kept chasing them. That's how emotionally addictive dynamics begin. Not through constant pain, through inconsistency. The human brain becomes addicted to unpredictable rewards far more easily than consistent ones. Psychologists have known this for years. It's the same mechanism behind gambling addiction. The uncertainty itself keeps the mind emotionally engaged. And unfortunately, many relationships operate exactly like that. One moment of affection, one moment of distance, One moment of emotional connection. Then confusion again. Your brain starts chasing relief instead of connection. That's not polarity. That's emotional instability wearing the mask of chemistry. Real polarity creates emotional movement without emotional destruction. That difference matters more than most people realize. Because healthy attraction may challenge you emotionally, but it should not make you feel emotionally unsafe all the time. It should expand you, not consume you. A lot of people never learn this because they grew up associating love with emotional unpredictability. If someone had emotionally inconsistent parents, unstable relationships, or childhood environments where affection felt uncertain, their nervous system may begin associating emotional anxiety with emotional importance. So later in life, calm love feels unfamiliar, almost suspicious, and chaos feels exciting. That's why some people lose interest when relationships become emotionally stable. Not because stability is boring, but because their nervous system was trained to equate love with emotional uncertainty. You can actually feel this conflict inside yourself sometimes. Part of you wants peace. Another part feels strangely drawn toward emotional tension. And until you understand the difference between healthy polarity and emotional chaos, attraction becomes incredibly confusing. Because both can feel intense in the beginning, but they lead to completely different emotional outcomes. Healthy polarity makes you feel more alive while still feeling emotionally grounded. Toxic attraction makes you feel emotionally addicted while slowly disconnecting you from inner stability. One expands your identity, the other erodes it. You usually recognize the difference afterward. After enough sleepless nights, after enough emotional overthinking, after realizing you've spent more time analyzing someone than actually enjoying them, that realization changes people deeply. Because eventually you understand something uncomfortable. Not everyone you feel strongly about is good for your nervous system, and not every emotionally intense connection deserves to be pursued. That doesn't mean attraction should feel emotionally flat either. Real chemistry still contains tension, mystery, contrast, emotional energy. But healthy attraction leaves room for emotional safety inside the intensity. You don't feel like you're constantly losing yourself. You feel more connected to yourself. That's the difference. I remember talking to someone after they finally ended a relationship that had emotionally consumed them for years. At one point, they said something that perfectly captured the entire experience. "I thought I was afraid of losing them," they admitted quietly. "But honestly, I was afraid of losing the feeling." That line stayed with me because it explains so much about human attraction. Sometimes people are not attached to another person. They are attached to emotional intensity itself. The highs, the relief, the temporary feeling of emotional aliveness. But real love is not supposed to feel like emotional withdrawal every time attention disappears. Real connection should not require constant emotional suffering to feel meaningful. And maybe that's why some of the healthiest relationships feel unfamiliar at first. Not because they lack chemistry. Because your nervous system finally has space to rest. No constant confusion. No emotional guessing games. No fear of losing connection every few hours. Just emotional presence. And strangely enough, for people used to chaos, peace can initially feel less exciting than anxiety. Until one day they realize something important. The strongest attraction is not the person who makes your emotions spiral uncontrollably. It's the person who makes you feel deeply alive without making you lose yourself in the process. Chapter 5. The strongest attraction happens when two energies stop competing. You notice it during a small argument that shouldn't have become an argument at all. One person says something slightly defensive, the other responds with more control. Then suddenly neither person is listening anymore. Both are trying to win the emotional position. Both are trying to stay in control of the interaction. And somewhere underneath the conversation, attraction quietly disappears. Not because love disappeared, because emotional polarity did. A lot of people misunderstand polarity completely. They think it means dominance, control, traditional gender roles, someone leading while someone else follows. But real polarity is much deeper than that. It's energetic contrast. The feeling that two people bring different emotional energies into the same space in a way that creates movement instead of resistance. You can feel it immediately when it exists. One person brings calm while the other brings emotional expression. One person grounds the moment while the other softens into it. One person creates direction while the other creates emotional warmth. Neither energy is superior, but together they create tension in the most beautiful sense of the word. Because attraction often grows when people stop fighting for the exact same emotional role. You can see this clearly in everyday life. Think about how exhausting it feels when two people constantly try to control every interaction. Nobody relaxes. Nobody softens. Conversations become subtle power struggles instead of emotional experiences. Everyone is reacting, defending, managing. But real chemistry usually appears in moments where one person finally feels safe enough to stop performing. I remember watching this happen with two friends of mine who had been together for years. From the outside, they looked like a strong couple, ambitious, successful, intelligent. But being around them felt strangely tense all the time. Every conversation turned into a debate. Every disagreement became competition. Neither person knew how to emotionally surrender small moments to the other. If one became emotional, the other immediately became more logical. If one tried to lead, the other resisted automatically. And eventually, both people became emotionally exhausted. Not because they lacked attraction initially, because they spent years competing with each other's energy instead of balancing it. Then something unexpected happened. After a difficult period in their relationship, they started changing the way they communicated. Not dramatically, just subtly. Instead of correcting every emotional reaction, they started listening longer. Instead of trying to win every disagreement, they started trying to understand what the other person actually needed emotionally. And slowly, the tension between them changed. It stopped feeling like resistance. It started feeling magnetic again. That's the difference between emotional competition and emotional polarity. One drains attraction, the other creates it. A lot of modern relationships struggle because both people are permanently stuck in survival mode. Everyone is stressed, overworked, emotionally guarded, constantly trying to maintain control over their image, emotions, routines, responsibilities. So even inside relationships, people rarely fully relax anymore. And when nobody relaxes, nobody feels polarity either. Because polarity requires emotional contrast, not sameness. That doesn't mean one person becomes weak while the other becomes strong. It means each person allows themselves to express different emotional energies naturally, instead of competing for the same emotional space constantly. The problem is that many people secretly fear softness now. Softness feels risky. To soften emotionally means lowering defenses, admitting emotional needs, allowing uncertainty, letting someone affect you. And after enough disappointment, many people unconsciously decide, I will never let myself need someone that deeply again. So they become emotionally self-sufficient in every situation. But attraction struggles to survive inside emotional self-protection forever. Because chemistry is not only physical, it's energetic. You can feel when someone is emotionally open versus emotionally armored, even if they say all the right things. That's why some people appear attractive at first, but slowly become emotionally difficult to connect with. Everything about them feels controlled, perfectly managed, carefully filtered, but very little feels emotionally alive underneath it. Meanwhile, other people create attraction without trying very hard at all, because their energy feels emotionally genuine, relaxed, present. They are not constantly defending themselves emotionally, and that creates space for connection. One of the strangest truths about attraction is that many people are not actually craving perfection. They're craving relief. Relief from performance. Relief from emotional pressure. Relief from always having to stay guarded. That's why healthy polarity feels almost calming when you experience it. Not boring, not emotionally flat. Calming. Because for the first time in a long time, you no longer feel like you have to carry every emotional role by yourself. The overly responsible person finally feels safe enough to soften. The emotionally chaotic person finally feels emotionally grounded. The hyper-independent person finally feels supported without losing freedom. That balance creates emotional depth naturally. And ironically, many people sabotage this without realizing it. They meet someone who actually makes them feel emotionally safe, and instead of relaxing into the connection, they become suspicious of it. Because chaos feels familiar, control feels familiar, emotional tension feels familiar. But healthy emotional balance can initially feel unfamiliar to nervous systems trained for survival. That's why people sometimes leave stable relationships searching for chemistry, only to accidentally recreate emotional instability instead. They miss intensity without realizing that intensity and polarity are not always the same thing. Real polarity does not constantly destabilize you emotionally. It creates movement while still allowing emotional safety underneath. You feel more alive, not more anxious. More connected to yourself, not less. And maybe that's the hidden reason opposites create such powerful attraction. Not because opposite people magically complete each other, but because different emotional energies allow people to experience sides of themselves they cannot access alone. The strong person learns softness. The guarded person learns trust. The restless person learns stillness. And somewhere inside that emotional contrast, attraction deepens. Because at its core, polarity is not about control, it's about balance. It's about two people bringing different energies into the same space and creating something emotionally alive together instead of fighting to become the exact same person. And sometimes the most attractive thing another person can give you is not excitement. It's the feeling that around them, you no longer have to hold yourself together so tightly all the time. Chapter 6, Desire, grows where there is space to miss someone. At first, you think closeness means constant access, constant texting, constant updates, constant reassurance. You tell yourself that if two people really care about each other, they should want to talk all the time. Every silence starts feeling suspicious. Every delay becomes something to analyze. So without realizing it, you begin trying to remove all uncertainty from the connection. You respond immediately. You explain everything. You over-communicate every emotion before it even has time to breathe. And strangely enough, the harder you try to hold on to the connection, the flatter it slowly begins to feel. That's the paradox most people discover too late. Desire needs closeness, but it also needs space. Not distance in the cold or manipulative sense, not emotional withdrawal, not pretending not to care. Real space. The kind that allows another person to feel your absence long enough to notice your presence again. You can feel this in ordinary life more than anywhere else. Think about the last time someone crossed your mind unexpectedly. Usually, it wasn't while they were constantly talking to you. It happened during a quiet moment, driving home, walking through a store, hearing a song, looking at something random that suddenly reminded you of them. Desire often grows in the spaces between interactions, not only inside the interactions themselves. I remember a period in my life when someone I cared about traveled for work for almost a month. Before that, we had fallen into a routine without realizing it. Constant communication, constant updates. endless small conversations that slowly became background noise. Nothing was wrong between us, but nothing felt emotionally sharp anymore either. Then suddenly they were gone for a few weeks, and something strange happened. The relationship felt more emotionally alive in their absence than it had during months of constant access. Small conversations mattered again. Hearing their voice felt different. Even silence regained emotional weight. That experience changed the way I understood attraction completely. Because I realized people do not only need connection, they need anticipation. The human mind naturally values what it has room to emotionally imagine. That's why mystery affects attraction so deeply. Not because mystery is manipulation, but because imagination amplifies emotional attention. When someone is constantly available every second of the day, your nervous system slowly stops noticing their emotional presence with the same intensity. Not because you stop caring, because familiarity reduces awareness. You can see this happen everywhere in modern relationships now. People spend entire days connected digitally, but emotionally absent from each other. Endless messaging creates the illusion of closeness, while slowly removing emotional tension from the relationship itself. Nothing has time to build anymore. Every thought is immediately shared, every emotion immediately explained, every silence immediately filled. And eventually, the relationship loses emotional oxygen because desire needs room to breathe. A friend once told me about someone she couldn't stop thinking about for almost a year. At first, she assumed it was because he was emotionally unavailable. But later, she realized that wasn't entirely true. What affected her most was how present he felt whenever they were together. He listened carefully. He noticed details. Conversations felt emotionally immersive instead of distracted. But when they were apart, he disappeared back into his own life naturally. Not cold, not manipulative, just emotionally independent. And because of that, she actually had time to miss him. That's what many people no longer experience anymore: missing someone. Modern relationships often leave no emotional space for longing because people fear silence too much. Silence now immediately triggers anxiety. People assume that if constant communication stops, emotional connection must be disappearing too. But healthy attraction often deepens through temporary absence. Not because distance creates love artificially, because distance reveals emotional value clearly. You notice who actually stays in your mind when they are no longer constantly in front of you. You notice whose energy still affects your mood hours later, whose presence changes the emotional atmosphere of your day, whose absence leaves a quiet space behind. And maybe that's why some people become unforgettable. Not because they demanded attention constantly, because they created emotional impact strong enough to survive silence. A lot of attraction disappears when people begin trying too hard to secure it. The over-texting, the over-explaining, the constant emotional checking. Slowly, the connection stops feeling natural and starts feeling emotionally managed. That pressure kills polarity quietly, because attraction needs emotional freedom too. You can feel the difference immediately around certain people. Some people make every interaction feel emotionally heavy. Every silence becomes tension. Every moment apart becomes insecurity. Other people create closeness while still allowing space. And strangely enough, those are often the connections that feel strongest over time. Because emotional space allows desire to renew itself naturally. You stop reacting out of emotional fear. You stop chasing constant reassurance. You stop trying to force emotional certainty every second. And suddenly, attraction becomes calmer but deeper. One of the strangest truths about human connection is that people often become more magnetic when they stop trying so hard to be chosen. Not because they care less, because they reconnect with their own emotional center again. They stop monitoring every interaction obsessively, stop shaping their entire emotional world around another person's attention. stop abandoning themselves in order to maintain connection. And ironically, that emotional groundedness often creates stronger attraction than endless pursuit ever could. Because real polarity cannot survive desperation for long. Desperation collapses tension. Neediness removes mystery. Overexposure removes anticipation. But emotional presence combined with emotional independence creates something different entirely. It creates desire without pressure. That balance is rare now. Most people swing between emotional distance and emotional dependency without realizing there's another option in between. Real connection does not require constant emotional access every moment of the day. Sometimes the healthiest thing two people can give each other is enough space to remain emotionally connected to themselves too. Because when someone truly affects you deeply, they do not disappear simply because the conversation pauses for a while. Their presence lingers, and maybe that's the real reason desire grows inside space. Not because absence creates illusion, but because space allows people to feel the emotional reality of what actually matters to them. Chapter 7. The people you chase often reveal who you are becoming. One day, completely out of nowhere, you run into someone you used to think about constantly. Maybe it happens in a coffee shop. Maybe through a random photo online. Maybe their name appears somewhere after years of silence. And for a second, your body remembers them before your mind does. You remember how intensely you once felt around them. The emotional tension, the curiosity, the way they used to stay in your head long after conversations ended. But then something unexpected happens. You feel almost nothing. Not hatred, not sadness, not longing, just distance. And the strangest part is realizing they haven't changed very much. You have. That moment quietly changes the way you understand attraction forever. Because it forces you to confront something most people never fully realize. Your attraction patterns evolve with your identity. The people who once felt emotionally irresistible to you often stop affecting you the same way once you become someone different internally. At first, that realization feels almost unsettling, especially when you spent years believing certain connections were meant to be. But over time, you start seeing attraction differently, not as destiny, as reflection. You begin understanding that attraction often reveals your emotional state more than the objective value of another person. The emotionally insecure version of you may chase emotionally unavailable people. The emotionally disconnected version of you may crave intensity at all costs. The version of you searching for validation may become addicted to people who withhold attention. And without realizing it, many people spend years calling certain patterns chemistry when they are actually unresolved emotional needs repeating themselves. You can see this clearly after enough life experience. Think about the type of person you were deeply attracted to 5 or 10 years ago. Then think about who affects you emotionally now. For most people, the pattern changes dramatically, not because attraction is fake, because identity changes attraction. I remember talking to someone after they ended a long cycle of chasing emotionally distant partners. Every relationship followed the same emotional script. Intense beginning, emotional inconsistency, anxiety, obsession, emotional exhaustion. For years, they believed emotionally unavailable people were simply their type. Then something in their life changed, not externally, internally. They started healing parts of themselves that constantly needed emotional validation from difficult people. They became more emotionally grounded, more self-aware, less desperate for approval, and suddenly, something strange happened. The same type of people who once felt irresistible stopped feeling attractive entirely. Not because those people changed, because the emotional wound creating the attraction started healing. That's the hidden side of polarity people rarely talk about. Sometimes attraction is not pulling you toward another person. It's pulling your attention toward an unresolved part of yourself. That's why attraction can feel almost spiritual sometimes. It reveals emotional truths about your inner world before your conscious mind fully understands them. The people who fascinate you emotionally are often showing you something about your own identity, your unmet needs, your emotional hunger, your suppressed desires, your future growth. And this becomes even more obvious once you start paying attention to who consistently affects you emotionally. Some people are attracted to freedom because they secretly feel trapped inside their own lives. Some are attracted to emotionally grounded people because they feel emotionally chaotic internally. Some are attracted to softness because they are exhausted from constantly being strong. Attraction often points towards psychological imbalance first. And once you understand that, your entire perspective on relationships begins shifting. You stop asking, "How do I make this person choose me?" and start asking, "What is this attraction trying to teach me about myself?" That question changes everything. Because suddenly, attraction becomes less about emotional possession and more about self-awareness. You stop romanticizing every intense connection automatically. You stop assuming every emotional obsession is love. You stop confusing emotional activation with emotional compatibility. And maybe most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself while chasing people who only reinforce old emotional wounds. One of the strangest parts of personal growth is realizing that some people were only attractive to a previous version of you. That realization can feel painful at first, especially when someone once felt emotionally unforgettable. But growth changes chemistry. As people evolve emotionally, their nervous systems begin craving different things. Emotional peace becomes attractive. Consistency becomes attractive. Emotional depth becomes attractive. And suddenly, the chaos that once felt exciting starts feeling emotionally exhausting instead. You don't force that shift. It happens naturally as your identity changes. That's why healing often changes attraction more than appearance ever could. A person can still look exactly the same physically, but if you no longer emotionally resonate with the dynamic they create inside you, the attraction fades quietly on its own. Because real attraction is never only physical, it's emotional resonance. It's the feeling that another person aligns with some part of your internal world. And as your internal world changes, so does the kind of energy you feel drawn toward. That's also why certain people enter your life at exactly the right emotional moment. Not necessarily because they are your permanent person, but because they awaken something important in you at that stage of your growth. Some people teach you emotional openness. Some teach you boundaries. Some teach you self-worth. Some teach you what emotional safety feels like for the first time. And sometimes their role in your life is transformation more than permanence. That realization softens a lot of heartbreak, because instead of viewing every lost connection as failure, you start seeing certain relationships as emotional chapters that helped shape who you became. Not every person is meant to stay forever, but some people arrive specifically to introduce you to a new version of yourself. And maybe that's the deeper reason opposites create such powerful attraction. Not because they complete your identity permanently, but because they expand it. Because every once in a while, another human being walks into your life and quietly changes what your soul recognizes as home. Chapter 8. Real polarity doesn't complete you, it expands you. At some point, you stop looking for someone to complete you, not because you stop wanting love. For years, a lot of people move through relationships believing attraction means finding someone who fills every emotional emptiness inside them. Someone who removes loneliness completely. Someone who finally makes them feel whole. And in the beginning, intense attraction can absolutely feel that way. You meet someone who changes your emotional atmosphere instantly. Life feels brighter. Your routines feel lighter. Even ordinary conversations suddenly carry emotional weight again. But over time, something important becomes clear. The healthiest attraction is not the kind that erases your identity. It's the kind that deepens it. You usually learn this slowly. Maybe after losing yourself in someone once. Maybe after shaping your personality around another person's approval. Maybe after realizing you abandoned parts of yourself just to maintain emotional connection. At first, you don't notice it happening. It starts subtly. You stop saying certain opinions because they create tension. You become smaller emotionally to keep the peace. You slowly disconnect from routines, friendships, passions, or parts of yourself that once made you feel alive. And because attraction feels powerful, you mistake self-abandonment for love. A lot of people do, especially when the connection feels emotionally intense. But real polarity does not require you to disappear inside another person. Real polarity allows two separate identities to become more alive beside each other. That difference changes everything. I remember meeting an older couple once while traveling. Nothing about them looked dramatic or performative. They weren't trying to impress each other. They weren't constantly proving how in love they were. But there was something deeply calming about the way they interacted. Completely different personalities. Completely different energies. She was expressive, warm, emotionally spontaneous. He was quiet, grounded, observant. And somehow, instead of canceling each other out, their differences created balance. At one point during dinner, she laughed loudly at something small while he just shook his head, smiling quietly. A few minutes later, he started talking about something thoughtful and serious, and she listened with complete attention. Neither person was trying to become the other. Neither person seemed threatened by their differences. And that's when I realized something important. Healthy polarity is not about changing who you are. It's about creating space where different energies can coexist without fear. That's why the strongest relationships often feel emotionally freeing instead of emotionally restricting. You become more yourself around the right person, not less. More honest, more emotionally open, more connected to parts of yourself you were forced to suppress in other environments. The emotionally guarded person becomes softer. The anxious person becomes calmer. The overly serious person laughs more easily again. Not because another person fixed them, because emotional safety allowed hidden parts of them to reappear. That's the part people misunderstand about healthy attraction. Real connection should not feel like emotional performance constantly. You should not feel like you're acting your way through intimacy. And yet many people spend years inside relationships where they are never fully relaxed emotionally, always monitoring themselves, always adjusting, always trying to maintain emotional security by controlling how they are perceived. Eventually, that kind of connection becomes exhausting, because your nervous system knows when you are no longer being fully yourself. You can feel it in small moments. When silence feels tense instead of peaceful. When expressing emotions feels risky. When disagreement feels dangerous. When you begin editing your personality to avoid losing someone. That's not emotional expansion. That's emotional contraction. Real polarity creates the opposite effect. It stretches your emotional world wider. You become more curious about life again. More emotionally present, more connected to your own energy instead of less connected to it. That's why certain people leave such a permanent emotional impact even years later. Not because they were perfect, but because around them you briefly experienced a fuller version of yourself. A version untouched by emotional numbness. A version less afraid, less guarded, more alive. And once you experience that feeling, ordinary emotional disconnection becomes harder to tolerate afterward. You begin craving relationships where you can breathe emotionally, not just perform compatibility. That shift changes the kind of attraction you pursue completely. You stop chasing people who only create emotional highs. You stop romanticizing instability. You stop confusing emotional struggle with emotional depth. And instead, you begin recognizing something quieter but much more powerful. The right connection does not constantly force you to fight for emotional safety. It naturally creates room for emotional honesty. That's why mature attraction feels different from chaotic attraction. Chaotic attraction consumes your attention. Healthy attraction expands your identity. One makes you obsess over another person. The other reconnects you to yourself. And maybe that's the final lesson hidden inside polarity. Opposites are not powerful because one person completes the other perfectly. They are powerful because emotional contrast creates growth. The calm person teaches stillness. The expressive person teaches openness. The grounded person teaches safety. The spontaneous person teaches freedom. And slowly both people become emotionally fuller through the connection. Not identical, fuller. That's the difference between dependency and expansion. Dependency makes your world smaller around one person. Expansion makes your entire inner world feel larger. And maybe that's why the deepest attraction in your life often changes you long after the relationship itself changes form. Because some people do more than enter your life. They introduce you to emotional versions of yourself that you didn't know were still waiting to exist. And once you meet that version of yourself, you can never fully go back to who you were before. The people who change you most are rarely your mirror. Maybe after listening to all of this, you're starting to see certain people in your life differently now. Not just the people you loved, but the people who unsettled you, the people who challenged your emotional patterns, the people who made you feel more alive, more aware, more connected to yourself in ways you couldn't fully explain at the time. Because this video was never only about attraction. It was about understanding why certain human connections leave permanent emotional fingerprints on us, why opposites create tension, why mystery creates desire, why emotional contrast can feel magnetic, and why the people who affect us most deeply are often the people who awaken forgotten parts of ourselves. Throughout this journey, we explored something most people never stop long enough to question. Attraction is not always logical. Sometimes the people who feel safest are not the people who make you feel most alive. Sometimes chemistry is not compatibility. Sometimes emotional intensity is not love. And sometimes the person you cannot stop thinking about is actually revealing something important about your own inner world. Maybe they reflected a part of yourself you abandoned years ago. Maybe they awakened emotional openness inside you. Maybe they reminded you how disconnected you had become from your own life. That's the deeper truth hidden inside polarity. The strongest attraction often happens when another person expands your emotional experience of yourself. Not when they make you smaller. Not when they force you to perform. Not when they trap you in anxiety or emotional confusion. Real polarity creates movement without destroying your sense of self. And maybe that realization changes the way you approach relationships from this point forward. Maybe now you stop chasing people simply because they create emotional chaos. Maybe you stop confusing inconsistency with passion. Maybe you stop believing you need another person to complete your identity before you can feel whole. Instead, you begin paying attention to something deeper. How do you feel around certain people? More alive, more honest, more emotionally connected to yourself? Or more anxious, guarded, emotionally exhausted? That distinction matters more than most people realize. So as you move forward after this video, try something simple. Pay attention to the people who naturally awaken presence inside you. The people who make conversations feel real again. The people who create emotional depth without forcing emotional confusion. The people who allow you to soften instead of constantly defend yourself. And maybe even more importantly, pay attention to who you become around them. Because attractions is often less about finding the perfect person and more about discovering hidden parts of yourself through connection. That's something you can actually practice in everyday life. Practice emotional honesty instead of emotional performance. Practice allowing space instead of controlling every interaction. Practice noticing whether a connection expands your identity or slowly shrinks it. Practice choosing emotional peace without losing emotional aliveness. The more aware you become of your own patterns, the more clearly you begin understanding why certain people affect you so deeply. And eventually, attraction stops feeling random. It starts feeling revealing. Thank you for spending this time here with me, and for allowing yourself to explore these deeper emotional questions together. If parts of this video reminded you of someone, or maybe even reminded you of an older version of yourself, then you're probably already beginning to see your own relationships through a different lens now. And honestly, that awareness alone can change everything. If you enjoyed this journey into psychology, attraction, and human nature, I hope you'll continue exploring these conversations with me in future videos. Until then, remember this. Sometimes the people who change your life the most are not the people who perfectly match who you are today. They are the people who quietly awaken who you are capable of becoming.